thank you so much for being here. I'm kind of blown away. I didn't know who would show up. So everyone who kind of came from the general public, you'll see some students mixed in here. Those are from my class this semester. It's a capstone course on death, literature and death, death, dying, and grief. It's a course I teach intermittently here at UM about every other year, roughly. I teach a version of it. And so this year, because of this NEH grant that we received, it's called, the broad grant is called Making Humanities Public. We're trying to come up with ways to kind of engage with the general public on a variety of humanities topics. My area of research is late medieval attitudes towards death and dying. And so I write and publish in that area, especially on the ways people used art and poetry in their personal lives to kind of manage their anxieties and their experiences of death and grief. And so my book kind of looks at that in the early 15th century. It looks at parish churches and books of hours and the imagery that helps people navigate that experience. So that's my profile as a scholar, but over periods of time I've developed through this class, hey Matt, material that focuses on grief and poetry. And so today, the whole point of this particular session is really a community conversation. I mean, that's the real thrust of the whole NEH grant to begin with, is opening up topics for general discussion that we feel kind of have a vital importance to the community. And I think personally, death, dying, and grief is one of the ones that has that centrality in our society, and our society doesn't really treat it that way. In other words, it becomes a kind of marginalized discourse in our culture. We don't have a lot of venues in which to have kind of open and public discussions. So that's the spirit in which it's designed. Larissa, where is she? If you have thoughts on those questions that you're willing to share with her, she was going to kind of take those up and maybe while we're introducing, jot some notes on those so we can kind of get a sense of where the center of the room is. Like, what are poems that you really want to discuss? And as she's doing that, I think we would start either way with this famous Shakespearean sonnet. In that handout, you'll see at the front it has a list of poems. And on the first page, if you turn to the back side of the first page, you'll see there at the bottom, that's Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, which I think is a great place to start. It's actually not about death exactly, right? But it will evoke some of this really important, powerful images that'll help us think a little bit about loss. Stephanie, is that a question? Okay. So anyone want to be Shakespeare? Anyone want to volunteer to read this? Yeah, and not putting that much pressure on you to actually be. Yeah, Arwen, why don't you read?
That time of year thou mayst to me behold, with yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon these boughs which shake against the cold. Fair ruined choirs, which late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day, as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth fade, doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire, that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon his must expire, consumed with that which he is nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well, which thou must leave ere long.
Where does this poem put us? Let's talk about, it's poetry, right? First, I ask you to reflect on this. What value does poetry have in particular for talking about this topic, death, dying, and grief?
I think poetry helps you explore different types of questions and try and answer them through writing.
Through writing about it when it's done?
Or reading it.
Yeah. Why would poetry serve better than like a philosopher reading a philosophical treatise on the same thing?
I don't know, it can just be abstract, like it can really be whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, maybe engages us in a different way. Any other thoughts? Poetry, why center on poetry in particular for this kind of topic? Yeah.
Well, I think speaking for myself, it makes me feel more connected to people who are left alone.
Good.
And because most poetry, I don't know what all you've chosen, is filled with feeling, then the deep grief that one feels during a sense of loss feels less lonely.
I love that. So connection, not just in the moment with the poem and with other people reading it, but also across time and in some sense that we are, kind of sharing a universal experience, something that's different. I mean, not different, that's universal to us. But okay, good. Any other thoughts on like why poetry, why spend time with this kind of stuff?
I think there's usually a lot of sensory awareness in poetry.
Good.
And I think that kind of like mindfulness to the present moment is really helpful to people who are trying not to be mired in the past. Like you want to recognize the current experience that you're having.
Good. So kind of put the sensory material, the imagery, right, puts us in our bodies, puts us in our place, and puts us in a time, in a now or a present of some kind. Good. But that's interesting, right? Takes us to the past, but also puts us in the present. And anyone sort of think of poetry as sort of exploring ambiguity? Exploring paradox? Yeah, go ahead, Randy.
Poetry makes you slow down,
Good. Yeah, and why is that important to talk about death?
just to process.
Yeah, and maybe especially if sort of we're thinking about our social lives, that this is the kind of topic we tend to blow through, right? Either to set it aside because we don't want to talk about it, right? So reading a poem slowly forces our minds to kind of work through something. That's great. Ambiguity, paradox, are those valuable in talking about death? Or does everyone have a real straightforward view of death? I don't. I mean, there's all kinds of terrain to explore in there. And so I think, one of poetry's key, I think, tools, we talked about imagery, that's a key tool. Management of time, ability to link across time, these are key. We got some chairs back at the back there. Yeah? And wow, it's just amazing. People keep showing up. Way too few handouts. I apologize for that. I only made 25. So if you can share with anyone around, that will help just to make sure, if y'all can kind of distribute, just to make sure everyone can put their eyes on these poems. Some of them I can pull up as well. So imagery, management of time, kind of an ability to move through time, handling ambiguous or difficult topics through means, through this medium language, which we don't always think about as a medium, but it is, right? It's a thing that moves. We move ideas through, back and forth. We exchange in it, right? And it's a medium. And it's a medium that has its own aspect, one of which is we inherit it. We get it from the past. It's not something, we don't get to just make up a language in a vacuum. So intrinsically, it actually links us to the dead. It intrinsically links us to all of the billions and billions of people who have spoken this language that we're sharing right now, English. So the medium itself it has a sense that we're connected across temporal boundaries and existential or ontological boundaries, right? We can move back and forth as people through this magical medium. Anything else? This is all very abstract, but I hope it's kind of helping orient, especially around questions of loss, which are some of the toughest ones to talk about moving into and experiencing loss and then feeling what it means like to feel on the other side of a loss, which this poem is very much about, right? So this is one of the most famous poems, in an obviously famous author's canon. What are your responses to it? How does it make you feel? What do we want to talk more about in that poem? What's the basic narrative first? The time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves are none or few to hang. What's the speaker's situation. Yeah.
It's the autumn life in a way.
Yeah, it's one of these natural metaphors that if life has seasons, right? Spring, summer, autumn, winter, maps a sort of cycle of age. So it's a late life age. What about that image? It's a beautiful image. Yellow leaves, or none, or few. What's that?
I can't hear you when you say it louder.
Okay, sorry.
Please or something.
Yellow leaves, or none, or few. That's the sequence. It's kind of a strange choice, isn't it? Mentally, where does that put us in the season? Where are you? What part of autumn are we in with yellow leaves? The beginning. No leaves? The end. And what about a few leaves? Just before the end, right? So there's a weird temporal motion in that line that moves you. It's not a unitary flow. We're at the beginning, the fullness of autumn. And there's a beauty in the fullness of autumn, yeah? I mean, there's a kind of vibrancy to that color. People, travel all around to, New England to go get that experience, right? So there's a vibrancy there. Then there's none of it. It's all taken away. And you think about this as a kind of painterly moment, right? That Shakespeare paints this beautiful tree, takes all of it away, right? Erases it all, and then he just puts a few more back on. But instead of, like in a painting, you would cover over those decisions, he gives you all of them. He gives you that whole experience of movement. Fullness of autumn, blank, bare, stark tree, and then back again. It's quite amazing. So in this I have a little short PowerPoint. It's really just a heuristic to get discussion going. It's not anything special, but it tries to pull a few of these things together. I was just talking about this with my students before everyone arrived. Closure illusions. These are just this idea that life has some natural motifs that symbolically represent closure, right? And so winter would be, we would associate it in this cycle as death. And so it's the season just prior to death. So these trees blooming or blossoming are that reference. But as we go back through it, we can sort of think, what are these other images? What are the component parts? So I just walked through one of them, the leaves. Oh gosh. And those of you who know a little bit about Shakespeare might have a lot to say about that bare ruined choirs, and I'll ask anyone if they feel like commenting on that. But I just want to talk about these images for a second. So in Quatrain 1, we have the tree near the end of autumn. In Quatrain 2, we have this evening sky at twilight. That's another kind of closural illusion, right? A kind of reference to life coming to its close, to the end. And then we have this glowing fire on the verge of going out. Right? Not quite out, but just right on the verge of it. And that's what makes this poem so powerful, is the way it subtly modulates each one of those images, rather than just delivering the straight version, a subtly modulated version of the image. So, in these colored inks here, I've kind of given you a few of these places where there's a kind of qualification going on, right? Thou mayest in me. Maybe you're seeing this. Maybe you're seeing this reflected in me. None or few. I've already talked about that one. We'll just skip Barroon choirs for a second. The twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west. And so if you just settle into that image for a second, right? It's not the sunset in its glorious grand phase. It's the sunset after the sun's away, the last little bit of it. So each one of these images is modulating, Shakespeare's kind of modulating and letting you feel what loss really feels like, which is not this linear thing, not this thing that kind of moves in a straight path, but has sort of modulations and changes in it. The glowing of such fire. So this pattern I'm trying to point out on the margins, right? Thou mayest in me, in me, in me. He uses that location in the self of the writer as the structuring device of each quatrain, right? You're looking at me. If you know, do you know anything about the Shakespearean sonnet cycle and who he's writing to? Does anyone have any story about Shakespeare and his young lover? No? Yeah,
Well, the beginning, he's clearly addressing himself to a young man.
yeah.
And it's an interesting relationship they have between them. And a little later on, there is the black lady, right?
Yep. So this Sonnet 73 is at the sort of third phase of what are called the young man sonnets. And in those early sonnets, it's very clear and it's very important that his young lover is young. That most of the sonnets are actually focusing on that age difference. And so in Sonnet 73, is why it's so famous, is the culminating statement of him trying to work through what does that mean? What is that relationship? What its future is, for example. And so that's part of what this in me, this device is structuring that relationship to the separation that the young man is going to experience, right? So if you think about how powerful this poem is, this is the person who is on the edge of death, right, who's aging, is actually turning around and writing it about the young man's perspective. He's sympathizing with what it will be like for him to lose, Shakespeare as author, to lose this older lover. It's quite sophisticated. So it culminates in this obviously intrinsic final line: to love that well which thou must leave ere long. What is that experience like? What does that mean? To love something knowing that you're going to leave. What is that experience like? What does that mean? To love something knowing that you're going to leave it.
It reminded me of the Japanese aesthetic of mono no ware, right? You have to be like things are beautiful because they're transitory. Like the cherry blossom falling is a more beautiful image than the cherry blossom blooming.
Did y'all everyone hear that? I know we're in masks. I know it's hard sometimes to do. The cherry blossom falling is more beautiful in this Japanese aesthetic of mono no ware. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of that, but it's sort of embracing ephemerality and evanescence as crucial to beauty. Not the thing that upsets beauty, but it's actually essential to its components. It's a great connection. And do we feel that sort of illuminating of our own experiences of loss? What does that illuminate for us? Does it resonate for you? Can you think of experiences like this that are... Go ahead, sure. You want?
I think it just kind of highlights the inherent value in any positive shared experience, any connection, even if you know it's impermanent. And because it's impermanent, kind of gives it more oomph.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I mean, so like, let's be really, was that? Yeah, go.
To go along with like a Japanese theme, I actually just saw Akira Kurosawa's Ikiru, which means to live, and it's all about someone who just got cancer. And then he goes about this adventure of like creating a children's playground. And it's emphasizing the fact that he wasted a lot of his life. And so I think just the fact of like the transitory nature of things, yes, it's beautiful, but it also, it's almost like an impetus to like go for it, like live your life well, do as much as you can, because you don't know when it could all be done.
Excellent. So that's fantastic. And that sort of illuminates, in a really important way, the voice of this poem. It's the older man talking to the younger man about exactly that, right? In other words, the sub-lesson is not just about their relationship. It's about this deeper lesson that you got to turn back to the world and appreciate all that you have, because someday it will all go away. That's fantastic. Does anyone know enough about Shakespeare or care to hear in that line, bare ruined choirs? It's a beautiful little image. If you spend some time upon it, the tree, if you think about all the ways the tree is corresponding with the body of the speaker, the shaking boughs would be an older person's limbs. They're not fully controlling them, that they're palsied and they're shaking. But those bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. What do you want to say about that image? Late the sweet birds sang in particular. There might be 2 or 3 or 4 layers to that one little line. What's the just most obvious thing you can say?
About tree limbs,
Yeah, what's the most obvious thing you can say? Yeah.
bare tree limbs, the birds are gone.
Yeah, but so like those other images, right? They're kind of there and not there, right? That he evokes them, so you can kind of hear them through the line, but they're gone. Where late the sweet bird sang. And so the limbs are choirs, choir stalls, right? That is the place where a choir would sit and sing. Why might that be relevant? Because there's a whole secondary meaning there, yes?
Choirs of angels.
Yeah, choirs of angels or choirs of monks, choirs, some group singing that is a human group, not an animal group, right? So the metaphor, the comparison shifts into this totally other register, this other register of feeling and sensation. So in Shakespeare's England, what has happened to those choir stalls inside the churches? What has just happened in his life in the late 16th century? Anyone know this? Protestant Revolution. Protestant reformers came into the churches, and one of the first things they did was rip all of those choir stalls out because they represented the ornate Catholicism of the prior regime, right? That is, the Protestant Revolution threw out that kind of ornate, overly decorative, overly ornamental form of Christianity, and they went for a more austere, Protestant, pure form. So there's a lot of loss in that stanza. That loss is not just about the personal relationship, it's also a cultural loss, a sense that something, in other words, whether or not Shakespeare was a crypto-Catholic is a big debate, but one way or another, anyone in the late 16th century would recognize something was lost. Little historical footnote, Shakespeare's father was the person who, in Stratford, ripped all of the choir stalls out. He was in charge of the complete remake of the church. So there's a whole other element there of his relationship with his father, right? So it's a really rich, dense line. There's one more layer to it. Can anyone hear the word behind the word choir? Look on your page. You see on the left a romantic type, and on the right you see a print edition. Look at that line. What's there in the actual print edition? How's it spelled? Can anyone make that out? It's with a Q. What is a Q-U-I-R-E? Yeah, choir. No, I think I saw a moment of recognition over here. Josh, what's a choir?
Like in a book.
A book, exactly. Books are organized into choirs, into units. They're, you can see this in any book you have. You probably never even notice it because they're sewn, right? But each book has a choir, so it's a unit of a book. So there's layer after layer going on just in that one line about senses of loss. What a sense of loss is. The loss of the book, loss of the page, loss of his culture's sort of center of meaning, a church, a place where people would sing together in kind of community. All of that falling back down onto the personal relationship between him and this lover. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Grief. Do we have grief, for objects? Yeah, I think we do, right? Why? Where does that come from? Yeah.
Because our identity is kind of becomes balanced itself with objects, and
Yeah.
then like the object is lost and a part of ourselves, and we become vessel. It's no longer.
Yeah, I grew up in Austin, Texas, and there's a whole website dedicated. It's called Lost Austin. It's all these buildings that have been destroyed. They're no longer there, right? It's pictures. So we live in a place that's going through a ton of change right now. I mean, so people are talking about that in Missoula right now. They're talking about the old Missoula, right? That's a trope of this town's sort of culture, right? There's grief there. There's real grief. And if we don't have ways to talk about that grief, we're going to get angry, right? and it might be the other way around, right? Maybe some of the discussion of that grief, of loss, might cause us to change our zoning laws. Or, you see what I'm saying? Like, grief can be a mobilizing force. It can things like this can remind us that the worlds we live in are also, I think you're right on the money, that not just objects, but our spaces. We project our values into them. They're part of us, right? They become part of us as individuals and as communities, and they carry a certain set of values with us. So their loss means something. It's not idle or insignificant. That's great. Anything else to say about this poem? We've said a lot. Yeah.
I'm 80 years old, And I think about death.
80 going on 60.
I think about death a lot more than I did before. And the one line there, that on the, let's see, that on the ashes of his youth doth lie. That's where I am. I'm lying on the ashes of my youth. And I was trying to figure out how I would react to seeing this poem at an earlier stage of life.
Yeah.
And I'm reading different lines that fit me in the stage of life that I am. I would imagine that happens with everybody.
100%. Well, so we got some people from different phases of life. Other lines jump out at you as, I mean, that's a really powerful one, sort of identifying directly with that notion that you're lying on. Other lines that others of you kind of resonated for you? Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting point because I didn't resonate with as much as the direct quotes. So like the deathbed and the doth lie on their ashes, and more connected with like the process, like the line when yellow leaves or none or few do hang.
So you identified more with that kind of cyclical imagery. Is that what I'm kind of hearing?
Yeah. More so with the process than the actual death.
What about the back end of this? We just take the first half. We just read his youth doth lie. What does it mean? Gosh, you nodded. Yeah, youth is a kind of itself kind of self-deceiving potentially, right? So it's there. Once you this is Shakespeare, right? When you start carving up his word, this is part of the way he patterns his lying and deception are a crucial theme throughout the sonnet sequence. So how do we lie to ourselves? Are we willing to tell the truth to ourselves? So there's a way of reading just this back half of the line as on its own, as a kind of statement on the intrinsic lie that is youth, that you sort of imagine yourself always in that phase. I was talking with my class about the vaccination rate of our 20-somethings in Missoula in this exact vein, thinking to myself, that this is one of those moments where youth is lying to itself when it imagines itself invulnerable, to the world around it. That's a dangerous lie, potentially. That's great. Any other thoughts on this? Yeah.
It's not related to a specific line, but the overall theme. And what I think is interesting is I wonder if Shakespeare himself knew at the time. I mean, I'm not so well versed on Shakespeare to know if he was actually famous in his day. We think it is afterwards.
Yeah, no, he was. Yeah.
But this is a confrontation with his own bodily, corporeal death. But the fact that we're talking about this right now means that there's a symbolic immortality in his work, and he's still very much alive in that sense.
Oh, 100%. And he is very acutely aware throughout the sonnet cycle of that exact theme. That part of its main theme, in fact, early on is, I'm going to die, you're going to die, but this poem is going to last forever, right? So that is I think you're catching on something really important to the larger Shakespearean project, right? Which is immortalizing a version of yourself in words that transcends. It's what Becker would call an immortality project, right? A project that extends your life beyond itself. That's really good. Shall we move on? What other poems do you want to talk about? I think, where's Larissa? She was going around to sort of see, are there some obvious candidates for other poems? So I've clustered these poems. People were drifting in, and we just kind of plunged in, and I didn't talk about the shape of it, but I put these poems together in clusters. That first cluster is on grief and grieving and loss. Lovers, spouses, partners, parents. Those are a couple of these are traditional forms. Sonnets, right? That's the sonnet we just read. The villanelle, the two villanelles on that list are famous villanelles. One by Elizabeth Bishop, one by Yeats. Do not go gentle into that good night. Maybe you've heard that poem. That's a relatively famous one. So if it's a famous one, maybe this one we should pass on. But those are clustered to talk about our relationships and the way grief mediates our relationships, shapes them, and reshapes them. There's a few in here that are about spouses in particular. The Dissolution by John Donne the famous Milton sonnet, "Methought I saw my late espoused saint." We find an interesting thing when we look at the poetry of grief around spouses, and there may be people in this room who have lost spouses that can relate to this, and others of you can as well. But we tend to internalize our partners really deeply. They become part of who we are in a very real material sense. Couples that have been together a long time offload memories on one another and practices on one another. You sort of rely on the other person to complete you in a certain way. And then when you lose that person, it can kind of feel like a haunting. It can kind of feel like you have a person that's floating around with you even though they're not there, right? So a lot of the poetry of grief around spouses and partners and lovers kind of has that quality of a haunting, haunting quality. The Hardy poem is one we could probably just read and not talk about because it's pretty straightforward. The voice, to kind of voice this idea. Someone want to be Hardy? Volunteer to read this? Yeah. Can you boom it out?
I'll try to boom.
Mask and all.
Woman much missed, how you called to me, saying that now you are not as you were when you had changed from the one who was all to me, but as at first when our day was fair. Can it be you that I hear? Let me view you then, standing as when I drew near to the town, where you would wait for me, yes, as I knew you then, even to the original air blue gown. Or is it only the breeze in its listlessness traveling across the wet mead to me here, you being ever dissolved to wan listlessness, heard no more again far or near. Thus I, faltering forward, leaves around me falling, wind oozing thin through the thorn from Norwood, and the woman calling.
It's pretty powerful. It's simple, right? There's nothing in the language or in the diction that's particularly hard, but it's really expressive. And that last we were talking about imagery in the Shakespearean sonnet. There isn't very much imagery until that last bit, right? That it kind of works the opposite of Shakespeare's poem. Shakespeare's poem uses imagery to kind of develop a set of ideas. This one starts with the feeling. It starts with the sensation. It starts with the scenario of hearing, or it's called the voice, right? Hearing the voice of an absent spouse. Just a little biographical thing. Hardy lost his wife and wrote obsessively about her. He wrote dozens and dozens of poems about her. So this was his sort of late life obsession was, we would say probably an unhealthy mourning, but it's his mourning practice. His mourning and grief practice was to use his poetry to kind of write out that experience. And so talking to this absent voice, this disembodied voice, and then in that last set of lines, coming back to it, the body, coming back to the physical place where he experiences all of this. Does anyone have any thoughts about it, or should we just let it sit on its own?
I like the way that the phrasing is on the page, because when he comes back to center, and the final part, that's the only part that's centered, isn't it?
Oh, good, in the typography, yes. And it's a stumbling quality. So the lines are long, right? And then all of a sudden, thus I faltering forward, right? So that a stuttering quality is almost like he's missed a step in his walk. He's walking and he can't make the next step and he's falling. That's almost a metaphor of the whole poem, right? That he's moving and he stops and he hovers and he begins to fall. Leaves around me falling, wind oozing thin through the thorn from northward. So all of that language is a kind of language of a languishing human in a world around him that is also kind of falling apart, falling down.
Seems like he's trying to hold on to this perfect memory of her youth, but then I felt like him using words like wan and thin kind of implied an illness. That he wants to capture that moment of her youth and beauty when they were in love, but the fact of her death is kind of intruding.
I think that's great. Yeah, let me view you then. That's the hope, right? You're thinking here of the original air blue gown, the imagery that would be associated with the idealized version. It's a hope that then the reality is not allowing him to occupy. She's kind of suspended between those two things. I think that's really good. Wan and thin, I like that you heard those together. I think that's a great, connection, verbal connection. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's also interesting that throughout the poem he's addressing her as you, and you that I hear, yes I knew you. And then the last line is, and the woman calling. And suddenly it's not her as in you. He can't directly address her anymore. And I think that's a really powerful moment. Suddenly it isn't just her.
Yeah. That's fantastic. That's a great observation. Yeah, from the second person to the third, like, and that maybe captures this sort of distance that's opening up between.
So for your line also has woman, so it has woman and you.
Yeah.
So that's just interesting too.
Yeah, you'd almost say that woman and woman brackets it, right? Woman first word, woman there at the end, and then the you in between. That's good. Those are great observations. Yeah.
I guess in that final stanza, I think, you're faltering forward, but then it seems to transition from autumn to winter. So sort of rather than any feeling, sort of becoming colder and lonelier.
Yeah.
It seems, right? Leaves falling, leaves around me falling, and then the wind oozing from Norwood seems to me a transition from autumn to winter.
100%, yeah. And it's a transition that you almost just can't quite make, right? Or psychologically you can't quite make it. And here I am kind of reading from the biography that he often places his poems in these late fall. There's a very famous poem called Neutral Tones that some of you may know, but it's got this wonderful image of he's at the edge of a pond. He's remembering his relationship with her, and they met one day, and he says, everything around was just alive enough to die. That's the way of capturing this moment in the seasons that you're capturing, this transition into winter. But he's kind of suspended in it. And that's the fine line, right? Between sort of, go ahead, Gary.
Well, I think he may be faltering because he does not know the nature of the presence of the absent one. And that, I think, is just one of the great human questions.
Did y'all hear that in the back? Doesn't know the nature of the presence of the absent one. And how do you sort of grapple with an absence that now has to be remade into a presence that you can hang on to as a presence? And so, you're like coming at it philosophically, of course, Gary being philosophically inclined. And I was just going to say, kind of in common sense terms, that there is that boundary in our grief between languishing, wallowing, over-investing in loss, and healthy grieving, right? That is not repressing grief. And so all of those are going to be psychologically, morally, ethically, personal decisions and personal activities and personal behaviors, and that we kind of work them out, I think, a lot of times with one another culturally, and part of the reason why we're having these events and need to have them, right, is being able to have places where people can talk about what does it mean and so that, why is it a core human question? Well, because all of us lose something, right? All of us lose something that becomes permanently absent. We don't want to all of a sudden just sort of bracket ourselves off from it, right? In other words, we don't want it to let it become a thing only of the past, right? That the absent would be completely absent. We want to maintain its presence as absence. I think that's what you're trying to say, right? And so that's a thin line between that and what it would mean to continue to falter. So your diagnosis of the speaker is that he's faltering because he can't accept that the absence is complete and then re-engage with it as absence.
I think he's experiencing her presence, but does not know the nature of it.
Yeah.
And that's our condition.
Yeah. That's great. Larissa, Did you get enough input to see, like, do people want to go on to some other topic? Do we want to move to?
People were still kind of working on them, but yeah, I got voice was a request, and we did not play in graves.
I didn't
we
hear.
did not play
Oh,
on
we did not play on Graves, the Dickinson poem. Who requested that? That's a great one. I mean, no one wants to admit it. That's all right. I'm not gonna put you on the spot. But so I mean, and so just in the structure of what I've laid out, I've just given you some categories. Nothing special about them, other than they have these threads through them. And so one of the things I just wanted to say globally, and we don't have to go into great detail, but forms, poetic forms, of the many things that they do for us, right? One of the things is they contain grief. They provide not just grief, other kinds of emotions too, right? Love, passion, desire, hope, all those things. They provide a container for it, a way to kind of fill up and explore the idea in a manner that kind of allows us to wrap our heads around what it means to us, right? So that's one of the things they do. And villanelles, the two that I have on here, one is about loss, not clearly about death, but maybe, right? It might be that in the very last line, we sort of discover that the person, the you, is someone that might be a spouse or a partner that they've just broken up with, but it might be about death. But it's about loss. And the other one is this urgent appeal from a son to a father to rage against the dying of the light. And how you read that poem is like a Rorschachs test often for a reader. Are you the kind of person that thinks, all things being equal, live life to the least and fight death to the very, very end? Are you the kind of person that would say at a certain point, I'm done fighting with my death. I'm done resisting it. I'm done pushing against it. And when you make that decision, what are the people around you going to say? What are the people around you going to say about that choice? And so that poem is very much about that problem. It's about that problem which penetrates every family in America at some point or another, right? That just, statistically speaking, 70% of Americans say they want to die at home. 70% say they want to die at home. How many are? 30 or less, right? So we say that's where we want to die, but that's actually not where we die. We die in hospitals. And we die often in hospitals cut off from our loved ones who maybe haven't seen us for the days or weeks prior. So there are ways in which this rage against the dying of the light is built into our system. We want to keep people alive. We put them in hospitals because that's the place to do it. But it actually then creates an alienating scenario for the family, right? It creates a very complicated way to engage with that last moment, right? That was a little preachy there. I got a little preachy for a second, not exactly into poems, but a way to sort of think about that some of these poems have these ironic tensions in them that we are living with in different forms today, right? But we are living with this question of how far do I want my life to extend? How far do I want it to go to the very, very end? And families need to talk about this. They need to talk about it with each other months and years, decades before it actually is a hard decision to make. Because each of you need to build that muscle out. You need to talk with yourself. You need to talk with your loved ones. You need to talk with one another about what you really want out of that moment and what it's going to mean to you. So that's why that poem was in there, to kind of as a device to kind of get into some of that. I think while we're on this same so that middle set of poems is all, the William Carlos Williams poem. Did any of you know this one, Tract by William Carlos Williams? Written at a very specific time and place in American culture where the funeral industry was brand new. The funeral industry was just emerging at the end of the Civil War. I don't know how many of you know this story, but embalming and all the techniques of preserving corpses, all of that emerged out of the Civil War, and it transformed death culture pretty dramatically. And so William Carlos Williams writes this poem, Tract, right, with this really declarative opening sentence, to kind of start having a conversation about whether or not the direction funerals are taking are really the ones they should be taking, right? So these are things that are still with us. They're about the choices we make of coffins and the amount of money we spend on a lavish display, the ways in which the funeral industry kind of encourages a certain conspicuous consumption around the event of death. So, we're a century after Williams wrote the poem, but it's still got some pressing questions for us about how we do death, right? And so that's why that one's on there. It doesn't need a lot of poetic. It's one you can kind of read on your own and think about, right, in terms of, it doesn't require a lot of analysis. But this Rick Barreau poem, I think, is one people probably will be less familiar with, and so maybe it's a good one to turn to next. Does anyone want to give it a crack? It's a little longer. The Wooden Overcoat by Rick Barreau is right after the William Carlos Williams poem track. Yeah? Okay, let's hear it.
It turns out there's a difference between a detail and an image. If the dandelion on the sidewalk is mere detail, the dandelion inked on a friend's bicep is an image because it moves when her body does. Even when a shirt covers a little dorky black sun on a bit of stalk, the same way that the barcode on the back of another friend's neck is just a detail, until you hear that the row of numbers underneath are the numbers his grandfather got on his arm in the camp in Poland. Then is an image, something activated in the reader's senses beyond mere fact. I know the difference doesn't matter, except in poetry, where a coffin is just another coffin, until someone at a funeral calls it a wooden overcoat. An image so heavy and warm at the same time that you forget it's not death. At my uncle's funeral, the coffin was so beautiful, it was like to shoot a new light in the room where trees are signed. It made me think of how loved he was. It made me think of Shoshone funerals, where everything the dead person owned was put into a bonfire, even the horse. In that last sentence, is the horse a detail or an image? I don't really know. In my mind, a horse is never anywhere near fire, and a detail is as luminous as an image. The trumpet vine on the sagging fence, the clothes in the fire, each tattoo that I touch and move back, a three-part illustration of how to use chopsticks. Four-leaf clover, the clock face stopped at 12:05.
Great reading. I love that. So what do we do with this? What do we learn from a poem like this? It takes a very abstract idea, right? Detail and an image. Can you wrap your head around that after the poem was over? Kind of why that matters, why it would be useful or important or helpful to think before we get to that coffin at the middle.
They destroyed their horses, really.
It does jump. We can recuperate that horse in the fire with a poem by Maxine Cumin just in 5 minutes. So let's put a pin in that one and come back to it, because that's a poem about burying her horse. So what about this detail and an image distinction? Does it help us with wrapping our heads around death, for example? Yeah.
Well, I guess just like an image has meaning, or a detail is just meaningless, I guess, or fickle, but it changes with everyone. So like, the meaning that with the barcode didn't have meaning until we learned it had meaning because of his father. So it's like everything's a detail, but it can become like an image depending on what meaning the person has.
Yeah, and there's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing he says there. I know the difference doesn't matter except in poetry, but it matters outside of poetry, right? I mean, it matters if you say, glibly, why do you have a barcode on your neck, right? And you find out that the person, has their, then it matters, right? So we can say something about meaning. That image is the sort of system of meanings and values that are negotiated between people. So poem's one place that happens, right? But it happens out in our world all the time, where something that just seems like a detail all of a sudden takes on new resonance when the poetic touch is added, right? Which is, the poetic touch in this case would just be exchanging values, exchanging experiences and ideas, right? That would be at the core of that. Behind every one of these is a observation, a verbal statement of some kind, and an exchange of ideas, exchange of values. Yeah, go ahead. You want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I guess relating to death and grief, it's like, I don't know, a single, like, small object, like, I don't know, a coffin, it could have been your grandma's or something, so it has a lot of meaning to you, but then someone could have accidentally broken it, thinking it was just, you know, coffin, and being like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll clean it up, but it's not a big deal, that has more than that.
Yeah, yeah.
So they learned, like, oh no, it's your grandma's.
Yeah, yeah. Good. So, structure, how many stanzas? You probably didn't think about form immediately when you read this, because it's just like, here's some stuff, it doesn't rhyme, you know. How many stanzas? 7. Where's the 4th stanza, which would be the exact middle? Where a coffin is just another coffin, right? So we would say the poem pivots there, right there. And so it is a formally really deliberately structured, it's what in classical rhetoric we call a preamel form. So it means it kind of runs in a circle around a key pivot point. And the elements on either side of that pivot are mirrored, right? So it starts kind of with this dandelion on the sidewalk, and then the tattoo, the barcode, but then we end with an elaboration of that tattoo. Elaboration of, and how do we see that tattoo at the very end? Just think about the perspective for a second. You have to be kind of close, looking at the skin, right? So it's an intimate relationship. So there's a lot that's implied in the poem about the speaker and this other person. And it's a really fascinating poem for this particular discussion, right? Because it has elements of sort of the attachment to someone you really love and the recognition that the stakes of death and the stakes of the funeral, the stakes of loss are right there sleeping next to you in the person with these tattoos that you know intimately, right? So the point being that those are details that the speaker is now converting into images. They are details that the poem converts into the images associated with his deep connection with the lover. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
There's also just an interesting connection between whenever one gets a tattoo, usually it's a big decision, or I think it can be a decision, not a big decision, but it's supposed to be forever. You put it on the body, there's a permanence to it.
Yeah.
But actually, it only lasts as long as we last. And eventually, with the decay of our bodies, that tattoo is no longer. Excellent.
100%. So yeah, you anticipated everything I would have said about it. That was eloquently put, right? That the body is the medium, right? That in the same way that the poem is the medium of the poet, the body is the medium of the tattoo, and the tattoo is only as permanent as the body. That's so well put. And so we could say then that the word in italics there, right in the middle, right there, 3 things in italics: detail, image, and wooden overcoat, right? And that wooden overcoat is, in fact, exactly at the center of the poem, right? That is in the 4th stanza. It's the 2nd line of a 4-line quatrain. So it's the pivot point is that single word. And if you're like me, kind of like you think about the craft of an object like this poem and how it unfolded, right? This doesn't get written in a fit of frenzy, right? This is a thought, even though it feels as you're reading it very fluid, like it's almost following the thought process, it's actually immaculately well constructed to lay out this set of ideas. So what was the sort of origin of the poem? Probably hearing this phrase, wooden overcoat, or coming up with it, right? And so there it is, right there in the middle. And again, it's death, dying, grief. We're trying to pull some of these things out. We all know how uncomfortable these experiences of watching the coffin go in the ground are. I had a dear beloved aunt die in the spring, and I went to my first ever natural funeral in the spring. I don't know if any of you have ever been to those. They are powerful. But this is how bodies were buried for 2,500 years, right? In other words, in the West, especially in the medieval period, you'd put the body in the coffin, but then you would go to the grave, and the coffin would not get buried with the body. The body would be taken out and put down in the grave. And that's how this funeral went. So we have now reinvented a term for it, a natural burial. She was buried in muslin cloth and wooden overcoat calling. and flowers placed on top of her. And it was such a powerful moment for me. But every single moment you've ever experienced of a funeral has moments like that in it, right? Singular, crystallizing moments where the finality of the death is brought home to you, right? And so that's what I find powerful about this poem, is that in that moment, the poet is finding poetry. The poet is discovering an act of poetry. And so for me, that is very much about reclaiming what we can do with these moments, what they mean to us, reclaiming how we can construct them and constitute them, right? We can make our funerals, we can make that experience poetic. We have the power to do it. We have the power to connect, to convert details into images, to take what is otherwise a sort of commercialized process run by an industry that makes money off of your fear and anxiety, and convert it into an act of poetry. Convert it into something that's meaningful for you and everyone that attends. So that's a weird thing to come to at this poem, but do you kind of see what I'm seeing there? Think about what happens after the wooden overcoat. So heavy and warm at the same time that you forget it's about death. At my uncle's funeral, the coffin was so beautiful. It was like the chandelier lighting the room where treaties are signed. So the act there, the act of poetry, is remaking the detail into something meaningful for the person. And that's, I think, the creativity, the sort of affirmative aesthetic creativity that we are all needing to bring to our experiences of death and grief. We're needing to convert them into moments of beauty, however that takes place, right? Whatever form or structure that takes for us. Any other thoughts on the wooden overcoat? That's going to stick with you, that phrase, wooden overcoat. And that's what makes it a great poem, is that phrase will stick with you in the same way that it stuck with the poet, and around which the poet built this constellation of other details. And the details that will follow around with you from that will vary. Each of you will kind of pick out other things that will kind of circulate around it. But that one thing will kind of be centered with you, that it'll hang around. It's a really powerful piece of writing. Any other thoughts on it?
Well,
yeah.
The detail thing with the imagery, when you have details, they don't mean anything, but we have an impulse towards meaning. And imagery is an impulse towards meaning. And it's a tool used in writing, and that extended metaphor and extended imagery. So to me, there's a feeling of motion that's implied when you think about image and detail, even though it's not conscious. You're getting pulled into motion.
I like that.
Almost against your knowledge or will that is a fact.
Whereas in this paradigm, the detail would be the inner thing that doesn't move, right? That the image. So yeah, that dandelion on the sidewalk, right, versus the dandelion on a friend's bicep, is an image because it moves when her body moves, right? So you're picking up that and kind of going another layer up and seeing in that a kind of allegory for how images work in general, that they move us in this allegorical sense or this metaphorical sense.
Yeah, for how the movement happens within us.
Yeah.
Because if we just get stuck on the details, it's a shoe, a black purse, a red coat, and that's it.
Yeah.
But imagery is something beyond that.
Fantastic. Yeah, if we wanted to get deeply philosophical about this too, do we? The philosopher Maurice Blanchot talks about the image in exactly these terms. He says, the image is the thing that refuses to recede fully away, that it hangs around. And he uses the corpse as his prime example. And again, if you think about the experience, if any of you have had it, and again, I know I have, and I know other people in this room will have this as well, of either having to see a loved one dead for the first time. In other words, maybe you miss the actual dying moment, but you come and you have, and this is what made me think of it, is the movement. That the movement that we associate with life, even if a person has been laying perfectly still and moving toward death, there's still movement. Their bodies, you can see their breathing and you can see their eyelids. And then when you see someone who is dead, that's the first thing that strikes you. That is that absolute stillness, the absolute stillness, that everything else goes away. It's very powerful, and it sticks with you, right? That's again not something you're gonna unremember once you've had it in your experience.
The experience of seeing someone who's bombed and disgusting looking.
Thank you.
I mean, unreal, waxy, weird. It was sad.
Yeah.
It was like, this is not what this horrible last image.
Yeah. So you just talked about the images on two sides of it. The same sort of the one that's been aestheticized, but in a way, in other words, like if we're just detached about it, the people who practice that art, it's an incredibly complicated art, and there's a lot of skill and technique, right? And you can admire it while at the same time recognizing the estranging effect it has on you. That in some ways it maybe distracts you from the grief rather than allowing you to fully experience it. That's a really astute connection. Arwen, you had your hand up earlier.
I guess I remember that. I just love how it seems like all these images are somehow, in a lot of ways, unintentional. These things are going to have meaning whether you mean them to or not. Especially, in terms of like the choices you make for a burial. Okay. I remember my great-grandfather, we were going to bury his ashes, and my grandmother came in the room with like this box she got, and it was a bread box that she bought at Goodwill, and she had forgotten to take the tag off. And my dad and I were going to bury it ourselves, and we have to take the tag off. Like she got it at Goodwill for $3.99, and we had to take the tag off first. And she had clearly intended it for that to just be a thing.
Yeah.
And somehow it became a lot more than a thing, just because of the moment.
The moment, yeah. The moment framed it or reshaped it in a different way. Did anyone else have experiences like this? I mean, I think these are becoming relatively common.
Summarize it a little louder.
Oh, sorry. So describing grandmother buying a bread box to put ashes in, but still buying it at Goodwill, but still having the price tag on it, and sort of a sense of it not matching the moment in a way. You're going to put these ashes that we're going to go bury. It's ritual, and yet, and I was just going to say, I think that we're going to have the more agency we take in wanting to create new rituals around death and dying, the more we're going to have to make decisions about what is appropriate, what is the right thing there, right? What is the value system? And maybe some of you have anecdotes. I've got one. My mom, my father wanted to have his ash spread on a particular mountain, Mount Bunnell in Austin, and my mom organized the whole thing, and we all showed up, and she gave us a Ziploc bag with one chunk of his ashes in it. Each of us got, and she had written our names on the Ziploc bags, like they were like, lunch sandwiches that we would be taking, to school. I mean, it was exactly like that. We walked in and we filed through, and she handed us our bag, right? Then we go up to the thing, and then we all kind of felt weird about it, and we didn't know really what to do, so we all kind of just drifted off on our own. And in a weird way, it ended up being great, because I found a tree, a very specific tree, and I had my moment alone with him in that moment, and put the ashes down at the base of that tree, and that was that. And everyone made that choice, right? But it was, so I think we can go into a space where we can say sort of traditional death cultures provided structure and a certain poetics, right? Like let's say that there is a certain poetry to the way traditional, especially Christian burial rituals go, and that some people have lost connection with those traditions and are reinventing or inventing in a vacuum a new set of rituals, right? And all I'm urging is that poetry be part of that, thinking about what are you going to do to make those experiences of value and meaning, and how can you think creatively about that in a way that will allow that act to become a poetic act, that will stick with you in a way that will affirm something important about the experience. Yeah, that's great. So anyone else want to share kind of weird experiences like that? Yeah, I got a couple of hands. Yeah, go ahead.
When my mom died, she was like very specifically like, cremate me, just put me in the ground, make it very simple. And then we realized after the fact that no one really wanted to like unzip the bag they gave us that was full of her remains. So she's it's her ashes in a plastic bag, in a wooden bag, in a marble box, like 6 feet under, just like so many layers of like, you are insulated from the world even though you're out of it.
Isn't that funny? You kind of reinvented the casket, right? The framed casket in that process. You sort of built it from. Yeah, that's so. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
My grandfather died about 5 years ago, and we just could not get together and decide on what to do, what was appropriate based on a number of reasons. But we still
driving around with my mom in her car. It has been for 5 years.
Yeah.
She traveled and rambled his whole life, so it actually is the most
Kind of fitting. Yeah, I kind of like that. And I mean, I'm sure some of you have some families that are doing what a good friend of mine is doing, which is every time they travel, they bring the ashes of her brother with them, and they spread the ashes at every location they go to, which is another way of. But again, think about how creative that is. That's poeticizing the person. That's taking the person's and making them part of your life experience, and not in some way that's like, I don't think that's macabre or dark. I don't think most people would. I mean, you'd recognize it for what it is, which is sort of making the absent present in a way, right? Recognizing that the ashes there are his absence, but you're bringing that whole experience with you wherever you go. I think that's great stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
I come from a Muslim tradition, so my father died a year ago. It was the first time that anybody close to me had ever died, whether like relative or a friend. And so it was the first time I got to see certain rituals up close. Like I myself am quite secular, but I saw the importance of these rituals as they were happening, even as somebody who's not particularly religious. And one thing that I thought that kind of went in the face of like, I think death denial and certain rituals that try to like abstract death or protect the body from the inevitable is like, there's the practice of, like a natural burial has existed in Islam for like millennia.
Right, yeah.
Where like essentially like you wrap the body with muslin, I think is the fabric, and then put the body like immediately into the earth. And I know for other family members like this thought was disturbing to them, the fact that like the body would be decaying very quickly and just like the natural elements and how that would affect. But somehow I felt peace in knowing that like there would be like this continuity or this cycle of life and like sort of like the giving back of what has been borrowed, for this lifetime. And so in some way I think that it's interesting to look at like different cultures and traditions to see how like things are done.
100%, and that particular tradition of the quick burial of the body, but the full family investment in Muslim tradition in all of the particulars. In other words, wrapping the body. I mean, I don't know the details of your cultural background, but you're supposed to actually engage directly with the body during that process, and that's something that the West has lost. That used to be essential to Christian burial rituals prior to about the 19th century. That the family had a direct physical investment in the process, and now it's not only that is hard. I mean, not only not happening, but it's hard to happen. It's hard for you. You have to do a lot of extra labor if that's the experience you want to have. If you want to connect to that. So thank you for sharing that. I saw another hand over there. I mean, we'll keep going in this vein as long as everyone's engaged with this. I mean, I think there's a great segue to that Maxine Cumin poem. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about, so a couple things. Like, I think there was this thing called Conversation Project, right? Trying to get people to talk about how they would want to die and what things are important to them, around the dinner table. But I think having those conversations, we can sort of create our own wooden overcoat. Like, what is a wooden overcoat to each of us? How do we want that to be? How can that be better for our families? And then we were talking about sort of extending by taking pieces of the ashes to different places. They're creating what they call birth plans for families who are having a child who's not going to survive directly after birth. And as part of that birth plan and part of that free time is, we'll go to the beach with your child, have dinner, have these sort of traditions honoring the child who isn't going to be with you after the birth. And I think helping people to think about those things in a sad but sacred way can go a long way to healing.
That's so good, sad but sacred, and yeah, some sense that we need the ritual, that there's a psychological need there that I think goes beyond. I mean, I didn't get your name, but your comment about many people in this room will say something like what your grandmother said, which is, "I don't care where you put my body." There's kind of that grouchy sort of, I'm not in the picture anymore, don't worry about me. There's a sort of ethic involved in that. But that's not what the family needs, right? In other words, that statement is actually about the dying person, not about the community left behind. And so that bit of it, I think, is really important for us to bring to the table for thought, right? Which is we need rituals. We need something to get us through these transitions, whatever they are, even if we're making them up, right? Even if we're creating them, which I'm a big believer in. I mean, that's why I think the session, right, is about poetry, but it's about this broad sense of what poetry is, right? That wooden overcoat. That's a different approach than the sometimes philosophical, legal, medical frames that we more often put around these experiences, right? We think about it in terms of living wills and the things that we're gonna, and get a living will if you don't have one. I'm not saying don't do that. Definitely do that, right? Definitely make your wishes known. But that's not enough, right? That the medical and legal structures that we build around death in our society are not sufficient for our community and for our family and for our value-rooted experiences at the end of our life. I'm gonna come to you in a second, but I got one more over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Is the coping mechanisms to remain personally from the families, or do you think the funeral industry has any business trying to affect a teenage boy in Albany, New York, who was stabbed to death from gang violence? I was working at the high school classroom, so teenagers returned from the funeral that morning. One girl commented how peaceful he looked, almost smiling. And I don't think this kid knew that a mortician can affect the facial muscles, but perhaps because of the youth and the horror in which he died, that his job, so that they could process it more easily. The family might not have known that they would do that, so that he would look happy.
So that was all in the form of a question, which yes, I think is the answer. Like those are contingent cases that every family is going to have a reason why. I mean, people who get murdered in any violent death or car accidents, there are all kinds of cases where the mortician's work is essential to as a kind of transitional. So I'm not a categorical person that way, right? I'm definitely not. I'm not even actually anti-funeral industry. I think the funeral industry's evolution has shown great adaptability, especially recently. Cremation rates are up in the United States, and that's because the funeral industry has finally kind of gotten around to them, right? But I think there are cases where, especially with young people and especially with violent death, where that final image would be a valuable substitute for an image that might be just, even if you don't see the body, like the closed caskets in those cases, might actually not allow you to get rid of the image you had in the head of the person being stabbed. I think that's a good point. So, just looking at the time, make sure those forms get around I just want to make sure that we get some stuff in your hands about future events. I'm not cutting the event off. I just want to make sure Larissa gets some stuff around. It's going to be a schedule of future events in the series. Some thoughts on the session today. If you want to share your email about coming to future events, you can do that there, and I can communicate with you directly about that if that's of interest to you. But I think just with the last few minutes, I think this Maxine Kumin poem is great because it rescues the horse, or it brings the horse back in. Oh, thank you, yes. If you didn't bring a pencil or anything like that, does everyone have one? If anyone needs one, I've got them here. So I might read this one especially. I really love this poem. It's quirky. It's called Whereof the Gift is Small by Maxine Kumin. Now, I'll start just by saying everything in that opening poem, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, and Short the Season, that opening line, that's all in her original poem, and then I've given you down below the poem she's referring to. It's a 16th century poem by this guy, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. If you know anything about 16th century, you know our fat friend Henry VIII liked to kill people. This is one of his victims. Henry Howard was from a very powerful family and eventually ran afoul of Henry VIII, and so he was executed at a young age. Very, very talented poet who kind of brought the Italian tradition into English poetry. Very powerful, short writing career. So that opening line, brittle beauty that nature made so frail, whereof the gift is small and short the season. That was the inspiration that led Maxine Kumin, and you can see where she cites that particular set of lines in that poem ahead. So I'll read that one. Whereof the gift is small and short the season, first ruby throat in the fading lilacs, a lissom in bloom, a honeybee bumbling in the bleeding heart, on my gelding's grave, while beetles swarm him underground. Wet feet, wet cuffs, little flecks of buttercup on my sneaker toes, bluets, violets crowding out the tufts of rich new grass, the horse's nose, and nibble like sleepwalkers held fast. Brittle beauty. Might this be the last? We don't even need to talk about it. I just love that poem so much. Its presence, and it's in the feeling of. So this is an animal being buried and being, or having been buried, and the speaker returning to that place where she has buried her house and kind of appreciating, behind it the scene that and I think this goes back to the point about the body of the beloved being reincorporated into nature. This is happening all around, right? I'm sure you've heard about not just natural burials, but some of these mushroom suits, mushroom shrouds. I don't know if any of you have heard of these. They're incredible, that are supposed to not only leach nutrients from your body and bring them out into the soil, but actually to pull the toxins out of your body. Every one of us in a modern industrialized society are running around with toxins in our body, right? So if we go into the ground, we're leaching all that out into the soil. So these mushroom suits are going to pull some of that out and repurpose it. And then there are these little sort of earth pod burial forms that are springing up in a few different places. So we are getting creative about taking that idea, that sentiment about returning our bodies to nature, and in true kind of human ingenuity fashion, and trying to make it into a ritual or make it into a structure that affirms that set of values. So there's something about this poem that makes me think about that, about finding that regenerative quality on the other side of a death. And just given our time, I think I definitely wouldn't want to end without making sure we heard a couple of these other voices. Might actually ask someone else to read it if I can't put my hands on it. Then I love this Naomi Shihab Nye poem, Making a Fist. It begins with this Jorge Luis Borges quote, "We forget that we are all dead men conversing with dead men." Someone want to read this one?
I love this one.
Okay, you do it. Yeah.
For the first time on the road north of Tampico, I felt the life sliding out of me, a drum in the desert, harder and harder to hear. I was 7. I lay in the car watching palm trees swirl, a sickening pattern against the glass. My stomach was a melon split wide inside my skin. How do you know if you're going to die? I begged my mother. We've been traveling for days. With strange confidence, she answered, when you can no longer make a fist. Years later, I smile to think of that journey, the borders we must cross separately, stamped with our unanswerable woes. I, who did not die, who am still living, still lying in the back seat behind all my questions, clenching and opening one small hand.
That's good. That's really good. Does someone want to talk about why it's good? It's hard to put words around it, right? But what makes this such a touching and powerful poem? I heard some O's back in here. Was that coming out of your camp?
I feel like.
Yeah, I thought that was.
It's something that everybody shares about. We're going to die, might have this fear, and it's a mother who puts her daughter at ease. And almost that the daughter doesn't have to really think about it anymore, except, as long as she can do that, she's fine.
Yeah, and what do you make of that gesture, because it ends with that image, right, of clenching and opening, right, one small hand.
Reaching against the dying light.
Yeah, there's something to that, and like a fist is, it's got some uses other than just emblems of death, right? So there's a fighting spirit in it, which I like teaching your daughter that part of life is being prepared for it. I like that part. But it's also kind of just like we could all do it right now, right? It feels pretty good. It actually is like a nice meditative thing, and to have this set of values and ideas attached to it gives you a kind of way to rehearse the constraint and release component of what dying ends up being about, right? It ends up allowing you to kind of rehearse that in your body to have a way to kind of remember it. Like that wooden overcoat, right? This is going to stick with you. You're going to have this way of hanging on to that image of the clenching that, you know, that you cling to life maybe, and then you let it go. And the relaxation part of that is a key part of what I think you really eloquently put, right? Which is the mother helping this young daughter figure out what that means. The releasing is just as important, actually, as the clenching. Yeah, go ahead.
I actually just wanted to say, I think like the fist thing was just like this way of, as long as I'm alive, I can cope and process with the absurdity of whatever situation I'm in, which is like, I feel like it's reflected in still lying in the backseat behind all my questions. Like there are no answers to the situation that they might be in, that any of us are in. But as long as we hold on to the fact that we are alive, that we are still, trying, we don't need the answers. We can just process it.
Fantastic. That's beautiful. Yeah. You did everything and more that I would have done with that line. That's still lying in the back seat line. It's so good. Behind all my questions. Fantastic. One more for the road? How are we doing? We doing all right? Yeah.
I wonder, but I think maybe that they are crossing from Mexico illegally to the U.S. because some people live in Mexico, and talking about the drum of the desert and all that, and about the ones who didn't live, and remembering them in that last line of punching them. So I think maybe they would make that illegal journey, and it's also about that way that but as long as you're moving, it's almost like a heartbeat when your hands are like that. Your heart is still beating.
Yeah, I like that reading, except for, I do want to stress Arab American in this case. Yeah, but I like that reading of boundaries, because boundaries are right there in the poem. Exactly, the crossing of borders and the boundaries.
Yeah. So the thing is, I think maybe it's a poem about that.
And the way I put it is maybe the refugee lies as part of the poem, but maybe not right at the center. And I think you can have it both ways in this case, right? You can feel that sense of what it means for the borders we must cross separately, being both, metaphorical boundaries or borders that we cross over, and potentially the experiences of people who are forced into this border crossing by immigration. So, Joy Harjo. For this one, I need a woman who can really own this poem, the Eagle poem. Who's willing to take this one on to bring us to a close? And I'll just say a word. Do y'all know Joy Harjo? Does that name mean anything to you? Yeah, go ahead. Who is she? Oh, yeah. Yeah, Poet Laureate of the United States. Yeah, and native poet from New Mexico. She came here 2 years ago, give an incredible reading. I don't know if any of you were there. Were you there? It was unbelievable reading. She often sings, plays music when she reads, and she's just an amazing presence. And has just last year completed an edition of Norton Anthology of Native American Poetry, which I strongly recommend you get. It's really incredible. There are 4, maybe 5 living Montana poets in that collection, and then a couple of poets who are deceased, including James Welch. So anyway, she's an incredible figure in our horizon, I guess. And I just think this is a great poem to end with. And we're definitely not going to talk about it afterwards. It's got to be something you just hear, and then we say our goodbyes. So someone want to read it? Yeah, I got a couple of. We've heard a lot of from the two of you. Is there someone that hasn't spoken that wants to bring it to a close? No? All right. Well, go ahead, Leah.
Pray you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know, except in moments steadily growing, and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of emotion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, serve
Amen. I can't tell you how happy I am you all came. I really appreciate it. Really, I'm blown away, actually, the number of people that showed up, and I really appreciate it. If you're interested in the future events, the next one is Ruth Vanita on February 7th. She'll be talking about Hindu death rituals, cycles of rebirth. There should have been cards that went around. I hope you had a crack at it that have that little schedule. It's also online. And there's some here on the way out. It would be wonderful if you would fill out a little evaluation form. It would help me so much to just hear your thoughts on the session and topics you might otherwise be interested in. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.